What if the real reason Prince Harry and Cressida Bonas split wasn't about royal pressure, but something much darker behind palace walls? After more than a decade of silence, Cressida Bonas has finally broken her silence, and what she reveals about Prince Harry's behavior behind closed doors is shocking. While the world saw the charming, cheeky royal, Cressida claims she lived through angry outbursts, thrown objects, and door-slamming rages. It wasn't just emotional distance, it was volatility, fear, and a relationship she says became toxic. In this exclusive exposé, we unravel the private chaos that shattered their royal romance and dig into why this confession is surfacing now. Hidden truths, emotional scars, and royal image games. This is the story the palace didn't want told. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The air was cool that night in London, the usual drape of royal tradition hanging thick over the city like an unseen curtain. News vans loitered near Kensington Palace, their antennas pointed skyward like metallic spines. Journalists stood on standby, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry, or hear a whisper of yet another twist in the ever-turbulent royal saga. But this time, the storm wasn't coming from Buckingham Palace. It was coming from a voice long silent, Cressida Bonas. After 11 years of silence, evasion, and carefully crafted public statements, Cressida Bonas, actress, aristocrat, and former girlfriend of Prince Harry, has finally broken her silence. And what she has to say threatens to send shockwaves through the already fractured British monarchy. Speaking in a quiet but deliberate tone during a private interview that has since been transcribed and authenticated, Cressida painted a picture not of a fairy tale, but of a psychological battleground where charm and chaos coexisted behind closed palace doors. It's not the kind of story the public expected to hear from the woman who once walked hand in hand with the prince through royal gardens, beaming in photographs, their chemistry appearing effortlessly sincere. For years, tabloids speculated endlessly about why the two broke up in 2014 after dating for nearly 2 years. Was it royal pressure? The relentless paparazzi? Differing life paths? But few dared imagine a narrative so personal, so deeply rooted in emotional pain, that it could challenge public perceptions of one of Britain's most controversial royals. What truly ended their relationship, according to Cressida, wasn't duty or distance, it was Harry's violent temper. To understand the gravity of her revelation, one must first grasp the public image that surrounded Prince Harry at the time. In the years following the tragic death of Princess Diana, Harry was cast alternately as the rogue prince and the wounded boy-turned-hero. He was known for his devil-may-care attitude, his military service in Afghanistan, and later, his humanitarian work in Africa. People admired him for his charm, his seeming lack of pretension, and his deep emotional connection to his late mother. He was seen as the people's prince, approachable and authentic. Yet, according to Cressida, that image concealed another truth, one that rarely saw the light of day. He was magnetic in public, she reportedly said. He could make anyone laugh. But in private, the mood could turn in an instant. One minute, we were laughing over dinner, and the next, he'd slam his fist on the table and storm out. The contrast was jarring. Her words do not come from bitterness or revenge, she insists, but from a long-held desire for closure, not just for herself, but for the countless women who've ever been caught in a relationship where appearances mask instability. She had no intention, she claims, of turning this into a scandal. But with mounting speculation about her silence and recent renewed interest in royal affairs following Harry's memoir and Netflix series, she felt compelled to share her truth. I wanted people to stop asking me why, she said. Why did I walk away from someone the world thought was perfect? I wanted them to know that behind the title, behind the glamour, I faced something I wasn't willing to accept. Not then. Not ever. The specific instances she describes are disturbing, not in the sense of outright physical violence, but in a way that reveals a deeper, more psychological aggression. Objects thrown in frustration. Verbal tirades sparked by minor triggers. Silent treatments that stretched for days. A relentless pattern of emotional whiplash that left her questioning her own sanity. One anecdote stands out in particular. A dinner party held at a friend's country estate. We were surrounded by friends, Cressida recalls. He made a joke at my expense, and I laughed it off. But later that night, when we were alone, he lashed out, accused me of embarrassing him. He slammed the door so hard, a picture frame fell off the wall. It was like something inside him just snapped. There were no witnesses, no bruises, and certainly no police reports. But the psychological toll was unmistakable. Friends noticed her growing withdrawn. Her vibrant spirit, once so evident in public appearances and performances, dimmed. Some attributed it to the pressures of dating a royal. But the truth, she says, ran much deeper. What's more, Cressida wasn't alone in noticing this volatility. Other women who dated Harry prior to Meghan Markle have described, in guarded tones, similar experiences of emotional turbulence and unpredictability. One former acquaintance, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, described Harry as intensely passionate, but also explosive. Another mentioned his tendency to spiral when things didn't go his way. These weren't random claims from tabloid gossipmongers, but whispers from within aristocratic circles. Whispers that few dared to amplify, until now. Cressida's account is especially compelling because of her credibility. She comes from a distinguished family. Her mother, Lady Mary Gay Curzon, is the daughter of the 6th Earl Howe. Her father, Geoffrey Bonas, is a successful businessman. Educated at Stowe School and later at the University of Leeds and Trinity Laban Conservatoire, Cressida has never been one to seek cheap fame. In fact, since her breakup with Harry, she's made a concerted effort to lead a private life, pursuing her acting career and eventually marrying Harry Wentworth Stanley, an old Etonian and real estate executive. Her life moved on, but the questions never did. I didn't want to carry this around anymore, she explained. People see the photos, the headlines, the glamour. They don't see the silence, the walking on eggshells, the emotional toll. That's what I lived. The timing of her statement is, unsurprisingly, being scrutinized. Why now, after 11 years? Some speculate that with Harry's own tell-all memoir revealing internal palace tensions and his candid discussions about mental health and family strife, Cressida saw a window to offer her side of the story. But she insists that it has nothing to do with revenge or notoriety. It's about truth, she says. Not to destroy, but to free myself from a narrative that was never mine to control. Indeed, the response from the public and press has been swift and polarized. Some applaud her bravery, thanking her for speaking up about a topic still considered taboo in many elite circles, emotional abuse. Others question her motives, accusing her of trying to capitalize on the media frenzy surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. But for Cressida, the point was never to sway opinion. It was to speak the truth as she experienced it. I don't expect everyone to believe me, she said. But I've carried this weight for long enough. It's time to set it down. In a society that still idealizes royal life, her revelations strike a discordant chord. They challenge the notion that nobility equals nobility of spirit. They reveal the uncomfortable reality that emotional dysfunction can exist even in the most gilded of environments. And perhaps most importantly, they underscore the power of one woman's voice, long silenced, now finally heard. As this story unfolds, questions abound. How will the palace respond? Will Harry issue a statement? What will this mean for the royal family's already tarnished public image? And more pressingly, how many other voices have yet to be heard? The answers may take time, but one thing is certain, the silence has been broken. And in its place, a reckoning may just begin. It had been years since the public had seen Cressida Bonas and Prince Harry together, yet their time as a couple remained embedded in the collective memory of the British public. In photographs from 2012 to 2014, they appeared every bit the youthful, attractive couple that royal watchers hoped would become the next fairy tale ending in a royal wedding. But behind those fleeting smiles and choreographed public moments lay an emotional minefield that no one outside the walls of their private life truly understood. Cressida, always reserved yet captivating in her own right, was immediately thrust into the glare of public scrutiny once her relationship with Harry became known. Her background, aristocratic yet modern, educated and artistically inclined, seemed a perfect match for the prince whose own upbringing straddled duty and rebellion. But from the outset, friends and insiders noticed a quiet tension simmering beneath the surface. It began with what some dismissed as normal stressors, Harry's near-daily battles with paparazzi, the endless royal protocols, and the impossible expectations set by media narratives. Cressida was expected to adapt, to mold herself into a partner not only for Harry but for an institution that rarely made room for individuality. Yet, it wasn't the pressures of royal life alone that drove her to the brink. It was the private man, the one the cameras didn't see, who, she says, began to show signs of emotional volatility that steadily grew harder to ignore. Cressida first sensed it during a weekend at Balmoral. The royal family had extended an invitation for her to join them, a clear signal that her relationship with Harry was serious. Everyone was cordial, even warm, but something about the environment unsettled her. It was rigid, performative. Every action was under surveillance, not just from media, but from within the family itself. She described it later as being trapped in a theater production where no one dared drop character. It was like we were all in a very old play, she said during her interview. Everyone knew their lines. Everyone knew what role they were meant to play. And if you forgot yours, there were consequences. But what disturbed her most wasn't the royal hierarchy or its suffocating traditions, it was Harry's behavior when the curtains were drawn. At night, behind the closed doors of their guest quarters, he was no longer the smiling prince. He became irritable, impatient. One evening, after what she described as a minor disagreement over a misplaced phone charger, Harry launched into a tirade, accusing her of being careless and disrespectful. He raised his voice so loudly that she feared someone down the hall might hear. It was just a phone charger, she recalled. But it was never about the thing. It was about control. That pattern, she says, became familiar. Something insignificant would trigger him. A delay in travel plans, a misunderstood comment at dinner, a social event he felt ambushed by, and suddenly she'd find herself apologizing for things she hadn't done. The emotional pendulum was dizzying. One day, he was affectionate, confiding his deepest fears about his mother's death, sharing stories that made her heart ache. The next, he was silent, distant, almost cruel. I kept telling myself he was under pressure, she explained. That the weight he carried from childhood, from being royal, from everything was crushing. And maybe it was. But it doesn't excuse how he treated me when no one else was watching. One particularly jarring moment came during a weekend retreat in Scotland. They had gone with mutual friends to a secluded lodge, hoping for a break from London's chaos. The group had planned a hike, but Harry decided he didn't want to go. When Cressida chose to join the others, she says he accused her of abandoning him. Later that night, after the group had gone to sleep, he confronted her in their room, shouting, slamming a chair against the wall. It wasn't physical, she clarified, but it was violent, in an emotional sense. There was rage in his eyes, a kind of pain I couldn't reach or fix. Despite these red flags, Cressida stayed. Part of it was love, the kind of love that hopes for change. Part of it was fear, of the media, of being seen as the woman who couldn't handle royal life. But more than anything, it was confusion. Harry had a way of being so vulnerable, so seemingly sincere in his apologies afterward, that it blurred the line between remorse and manipulation. He would say, "I'm sorry, I just get overwhelmed," she said. And I'd believe him. Until it happened again. Over time, her sense of self began to erode. She questioned her instincts. Was she overreacting? Was she being too sensitive? The gaslighting wasn't overt, but it was constant. Subtle jabs about her acting career, passive-aggressive comments about her friends, the gradual isolation from people who once grounded her. There was this unspoken rule that his world came first, she said. His schedule, his moods, his needs. I became an accessory to someone else's narrative. She tried to confide in a close friend, a fellow actor who had once worked with her in London's West End. But even in that conversation, she downplayed the seriousness. She'd say things like, "He's just going through a rough patch," or "It's complicated." The truth was harder to admit, even to herself. When the subject came up during family dinners, she deflected. Her parents were supportive, but they had seen enough to worry. Her mother reportedly asked her, "Are you happy, truly happy?" Cressida didn't have an answer. The turning point came in the spring of 2014. Cressida had been offered a major opportunity, a theater role that would take her outside London for several weeks. It was a dream part, one she had auditioned for quietly, not expecting to win. But when she told Harry, his reaction wasn't joy. It was disapproval. He said something like, "So you'd rather be on stage than be with me?" she recalled. And I realized in that moment, he didn't see my success as separate from our relationship. He saw it as a threat to it. That night, they argued for hours. Harry accused her of being selfish. Cressida told him she couldn't keep living in his shadow. By morning, she had made her decision. She accepted the role and, within days, ended the relationship. It was not a clean break. The press had a field day. Speculations ranged from Harry's fear of commitment to Cressida's unwillingness to conform. No one guessed the real reason. And Cressida, determined to protect both herself and the royal institution, remained silent. Until now. For years, she kept quiet, watching from the sidelines as Harry's life transformed. She watched him meet Meghan Markle, watched the royal wedding unfold, watched the fallout with the monarchy, and the eventual exile to California. At times, she felt relief. It wasn't her on the front pages anymore. But the silence weighed heavily. I didn't want to be defined by that chapter, she said. But at the same time, I didn't want to pretend it didn't shape me. So what finally pushed her to speak? It wasn't one moment, she says, but a buildup of many. Seeing young women glamorize royal relationships. Watching documentaries that sanitized history. Reading headlines that speculated endlessly about why she walked away from a prince. And most of all, witnessing the broader cultural shift where women were finally being encouraged to speak their truths, no matter how inconvenient they were for powerful men. I'm not here to destroy him, she insisted. I believe Harry is deeply wounded. I believe he struggled with grief, with identity, with pressure. But none of that justifies what I experienced. Her statement is not part of a legal proceeding. She's not seeking compensation. There's no book deal, no televised special. Just a carefully recorded interview released through a respected journalist known for investigative integrity. The interview, once verified, was turned over to legal advisors to ensure no defamation laws were violated. The result is a rare moment of candor from a woman who has nothing to gain and much to risk. Reactions from royal insiders have been muted. Buckingham Palace declined to comment. Those close to Harry have dismissed the claims as personal interpretations colored by the past. But others, particularly mental health advocates and women's rights groups, have praised Cressida for shedding light on a form of abuse often minimized or dismissed. And though some corners of the public remain skeptical, a growing chorus of voices is beginning to ask, if this happened to her, how many others might have stayed silent? The morning after Cressida Bonas's interview aired, Britain awoke to a media firestorm. Every major newspaper, tabloid, online magazine, and morning television program led with variations of the same headline. Cressida speaks out. The Daily Mail's homepage featured her photograph with the caption, "Silence Shattered." The Times took a more restrained approach, referring to her claims as disturbing and credible. But it was the tabloids that went into overdrive, with phrases like Prince Harry's private hell and ex-girlfriend exposes royal rage. Within minutes, social media became the epicenter of a volatile, global conversation. Hashtags like hashtag Cressida Speaks and hashtag Royal Revelations began trending across platforms in dozens of countries. Public sentiment was sharply divided. Some hailed Cressida as brave, applauding her for exposing what many perceived as a dangerous pattern of emotional manipulation by a man born into untouchable privilege. Others accused her of exploiting her past relationship for relevance, especially at a time when Prince Harry had become a polarizing figure due to his break from royal duties. Yet, beyond the noise and the memes, one thing was clear: her story had hit a nerve. In London, early morning talk shows scrambled to assemble panels of commentators, royal experts, psychologists, and legal analysts. On BBC's flagship program, a panelist with ties to the palace insisted the monarchy would remain above the fray, saying, "These are private matters from long ago, and it's not the royal family's policy to engage in personal disputes." But the damage was already done. Cressida's words had reignited a dormant but festering debate over the ethics of royal relationships and the unseen pressures that accompany them. Reporters rushed to old interviews, scouring every photograph and public appearance from her years with Harry. Clips resurfaced of her looking downcast at royal events, moments previously dismissed as camera timing now reinterpreted as potential signs of deeper distress. Meanwhile, in the United States, where Harry had relocated with Meghan Markle, media reactions were equally intense but took on a different tone. American networks, who had generally sympathized with Harry and Meghan during their break from royal life, found themselves in a complicated position. Some conservative outlets seized on Cressida's words as vindication, suggesting that Harry's issues predated his marriage and that Meghan's criticisms of Th. Liberal commentators, on the other hand, called for nuance. "We must not forget that trauma can coexist with harmful behavior," said one MSNBC guest. "Prince Harry may have suffered deeply after losing his mother, but if he's caused emotional damage to the women in his life, that must be acknowledged. Healing doesn't excuse hurting others." Within 24 hours, online platforms were flooded with think pieces. Headlines read, "Was Prince Harry always this fragile? Cressida's courage, what we can learn from her testimony, and Behind the Palace Walls, a culture of silence." Feminist writers drew parallels between Cressida's experience and the broader societal pattern of women being gaslit in elite spaces. Others questioned the wisdom of romanticizing royalty at all, asking why so many young women still saw marrying a prince as a fairy tale when the reality, as revealed by multiple insiders, appeared increasingly toxic. The royal household issued a brief statement that afternoon. It read, "We do not comment on matters of a private or historical nature." But by then, the story had already spiraled into uncontainable territory. Former palace aides, some speaking anonymously, began to reach out to reporters. One, who claimed to have worked in communications during the early 2010s, recalled tense interactions between Harry and Cressida behind closed doors. "He could be cold," the aide stated. "He was under immense pressure, but sometimes he took that out on people he loved. We all saw it, but no one intervened. You don't correct a prince." By the third day, the story had escalated into a full-fledged crisis for the Sussexes. Reporters staked out the Montecito estate in California, hoping to catch a glimpse or a reaction from the embattled couple. Meghan, typically media-savvy, made no public comment. A single statement was released by a spokesperson for the couple. Prince Harry remains committed to mental health advocacy and healing from past traumas. He wishes Cressida well and respects her decision to share her experience. The statement did little to calm the storm. Royal commentators pounced, calling the response dismissive, sterile, and lacking accountability. A viral tweet summarized the sentiment shared by thousands. "Advocating for mental health while ignoring the hurt you caused others is not healing, it's branding." Even international figures began to weigh in. A prominent human rights advocate from Canada praised Cressida's courage and urged more women in the public eye to speak out. Meanwhile, an Australian senator called for a broader inquiry into the psychological effects of royal life on partners and spouses, arguing that the monarchy, as a public institution, could not claim privacy while exerting such influence on national culture. By the end of the week, the story had taken on a life of its own. Online forums dissected every aspect of Cressida's interview. Was she protecting others? Did she know of more incidents involving other women? Could her claims spark further revelations about Prince Harry's behavior during his early years as a senior royal? The speculation prompted journalists to revisit Harry's past relationships. Chelsea Davy, another ex-girlfriend, was suddenly the subject of renewed interest. Though she had long since moved on with her own life, questions began to circulate. Had she, too, endured similar struggles? Would she speak out? When contacted by the media, Chelsea issued no statement, but the silence only added to the intrigue. Academics joined the fray as well. Sociologists and cultural critics examined how the public's view of the royal family had shifted over the past decade, from reverent and nostalgic to increasingly skeptical and confrontational. Cressida's testimony was seen as part of a larger cultural reckoning, one in which power dynamics, emotional abuse, and institutional complicity could no longer be ignored, even by those wearing crowns. Several universities proposed symposiums and lectures around the implications of her revelations. In a particularly pointed editorial, a professor at the London School of Economics wrote, "Cressida Bonas has done more to expose the psychological toll of the monarchy than any historian ever has. Her words cut through the illusion of regality and reveal the human cost beneath." The backlash wasn't one-sided, though. Prince Harry still had fervent defenders, especially in digital spaces where his vulnerability and openness had long earned him praise. Supporters argued that the public was quick to crucify him based on one person's account, and that his years of humanitarian work, military service, and advocacy for veterans should not be erased by past mistakes. Yet, even some of his allies admitted the timing of Cressida's statement couldn't be ignored. Coming at a time when public trust in royal narratives was already eroding, it added fuel to a smoldering fire. Questions arose not only about Harry but about the monarchy as a whole. What other stories were being hidden? What was the true emotional climate within palace walls? Behind the scenes, the palace reportedly called an emergency meeting with their legal and media teams. Though the statement remained unchanged, sources suggested there were internal debates about whether Prince Harry should address the claims directly. Some senior courtiers were adamantly opposed, citing royal precedent of silence. Others believed the sheer scale of the fallout demanded a response. At the same time, whispers began circulating that more individuals close to the royal family were preparing to speak. A well-placed journalist with ties to former palace employees hinted that another former girlfriend of a royal, one who had also left the spotlight, was considering a public statement. The suggestion was subtle but potent, Cressida's courage had opened the door for others. Public curiosity turned toward Cressida's motivations. Why now? Why after all these years? She made it clear in her interview, she wasn't seeking fame or retribution. She wasn't interested in capitalizing on the moment. Her decision had been slow, deliberate, and agonizing. But ultimately, it had been about reclaiming her own narrative after years of silence. In the end, I realized I didn't owe anyone silence, she said in the interview's closing moments. Not the palace. Not the public. Not even him. Those words echoed across newsrooms, dinner tables, and Twitter threads. They became a rallying cry for those who had also remained silent in their own relationships, whether in palace halls or ordinary homes. And perhaps most surprisingly, they sparked a subtle but significant shift in the public discourse surrounding royalty, not just in the UK, but globally. As the dust began to settle, a new question emerged from the chaos. What would happen next? Would Prince Harry respond directly? Would the monarchy change its stance on personal accountability? And most importantly, would Cressida's truth lead others to share theirs? That answer remained to be seen. But one thing was certain, nothing would be the same again. The quiet stillness that typically shrouds the royal palaces was shattered by an undercurrent of urgency not seen in decades. Behind the opulent walls of Clarence House, Kensington Palace, and Windsor Castle, senior royals, advisors, and communications teams were locked in emergency meetings. The bombshell revelations from Cressida Bonas had detonated a crisis so sensitive and far-reaching that it demanded immediate triage, not only to salvage the reputation of Prince Harry, but to protect the monarchy from a potential credibility collapse. At the epicenter of the storm sat King Charles III, grappling with the latest in a series of public embarrassments involving his younger son. Aides described the monarch as visibly agitated and privately livid over the way the interview had blindsided the royal household. He had been informed the night before by a senior courtier who had received early transcripts of the interview. The next morning, he convened a closed-door meeting at Buckingham Palace with Camilla, Queen Consort, Prince William, and the royal press office. One insider who had worked under 3 different monarchs noted the gravity of the atmosphere in that meeting. It wasn't just damage control. It was an existential reckoning. There was a realization that if more of Harry's exes came forward, the crown's very image, its mystique, its authority, its stability could be eroded beyond repair. Charles was reportedly deeply concerned not only about the nature of the allegations, but about their timing. The royal calendar was already burdened with delicate diplomatic engagements, state visits, and the king's ongoing health concerns. Any disruption, especially one tied to Harry's past behavior, threatened to overshadow everything else. Camilla, ever the tactician, was said to have been the first to speak up. According to sources, she advised a firm but silent strategy, acknowledged nothing, and refused to engage in personal commentary. Her argument was simple. Responding would grant legitimacy to the claims, and worse, might trigger further scrutiny of other members of the royal family. But Prince William disagreed. For William, this wasn't just another scandal. This was a direct assault on his brother's integrity, yes, but it was also a moment of institutional reckoning. He allegedly argued that the royal family's refusal to engage only amplified speculation and undermined their moral authority. Reports suggest he advocated for a private dialogue with Cressida, or at least a well-crafted public message expressing sympathy without an outright admission of fault. Charles, torn between generational instincts and modern PR realities, ultimately sided with Camilla. A brief, deflective statement was approved, while orders were issued for the Royal Communications Office to monitor media narratives hourly and prepare contingency statements in the event of additional revelations. The palace's internal climate became strained. Staffers reported a sharp uptick in tension, secrecy, and surveillance. Employees were reminded of their non-disclosure agreements. Security details were reassigned. Mobile devices were examined for leaks. It was as if the palace had transformed overnight into a fortress under siege, not by foreign threats, but by the ghosts of its own making. Within days, Prince William had quietly begun reaching out to trusted friends in the press, attempting to calm the storm without drawing further attention. Unlike his father, William understood the modern media landscape. He knew the cost of silence in a digital age where voids are filled with conspiracy, half-truths, and speculation. Some royal reporters noted a subtle shift in the tone of stories covering William, more measured, more grounded, as if laying the groundwork for a contrast between brothers, one reckless, the other responsible. But behind closed doors, William was reportedly furious with Harry, not just because of the scandal, but because it was happening all over again. First Meghan, now Cressida. Another woman publicly accusing his brother of emotional turmoil, another crisis pulling the family into disrepute. And just like before, there was no roadmap to clean it up without making it worse. Elsewhere in the family, reactions varied wildly. Princess, and stoic as ever, was said to be indifferent outwardly but privately expressed concern about the institution's long-term resilience. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, reportedly told a friend that the revelations were unsurprising, and that Cressida always seemed to carry a weight she couldn't explain. But it was Princess Catherine whose reaction struck the deepest chord internally. According to palace insiders, she felt blindsided. Though she and Cressida were never particularly close, Catherine had always seen the young woman as a stabilizing force during Harry's most tumultuous years. She reportedly viewed the revelations as a betrayal, not of the royal family, but of the emotional trust once shared within its inner circle. Worse, Catherine now feared that more stories could emerge. If Cressida's relationship with Harry had been so troubled, what did that say about the palace's vetting processes? About the support, or lack thereof, offered to women who dated or married royals? And if the palace's official line was to deny or dismiss these experiences, what precedent would that set for future generations? Beyond the emotional fallout, the strategic calculations were even more complex. Royal advisors pored over spreadsheets and charts outlining public sentiment, media reach, social media virality, and polling data. The numbers painted a grim picture. Trust in the monarchy among younger generations had dipped sharply since Cressida's interview. Among millennials and Gen Z respondents in the UK, support for the royal institution dropped below 40%, its lowest level in decades. Advisors realized the monarchy couldn't afford to let the story fester, but they were paralyzed by the risks of engaging it. A single misstep could trigger a domino effect. Renewed scrutiny on past relationships, further estrangement between Harry and the palace, and perhaps even fresh calls for royal reform or abolition. To complicate matters further, whispers began to circulate that Meghan Markle was considering her own interview to respond to Cressida's claims. Though no formal announcement had been made, speculation surged after one of Meghan's longtime publicists was spotted meeting with a major American broadcaster in Los Angeles. The implication was clear: if Meghan stepped forward in Harry's defense, the palace would be forced to react, and that reaction, in turn, could reopen old wounds the family had fought to keep closed. By week's end, the monarchy was in survival mode. Efforts were made to redirect public attention. Photo ops with Charles visiting charities, Catherine attending children's hospitals, William engaging in environmental diplomacy. But every appearance was shadowed by the same question shouted from reporters. Do you have a comment on Cressida Bonas's interview? The royals didn't answer. They never do. But the silence was deafening. In private, Charles reportedly contacted Harry, perhaps the most telling move of all. Though the content of the call remains undisclosed, royal aides confirmed that the monarch had reached out personally. Some interpret the gesture as an attempt at damage control. Others saw it as a rare moment of paternal concern. But sources close to Harry claim the call did little to mend the emotional chasm between father and son. As for Harry, reports from California suggested he was shaken by the fallout. Friends described him as angry but deeply reflective, torn between the urge to defend himself and the awareness that doing so might only escalate tensions. In Montecito, the gates to the Sussex home remained firmly closed, but drone footage captured Harry walking alone on the property's edge, head down, earbuds in, perhaps seeking clarity in a moment of chaos. Back in Britain, the monarchy had begun consulting external PR firms with crisis expertise. Several scenarios were mapped out, ranging from total media silence to a strategically timed documentary focused on royal duty and humanitarian work, designed to distract and rehabilitate the family's image. But no plan could erase what had already been said. The words were out there. The damage was done. Perhaps the most telling moment came at the next royal engagement, a state dinner at Windsor Castle. As cameras flashed and guests mingled under the chandeliers, King Charles raised a toast. His speech was elegant, rehearsed, and devoid of controversy. But as he lowered his glass, there was a fleeting pause, an uncharacteristic hesitation that didn't go unnoticed by those in attendance. It was as if, for a brief moment, the sovereign himself recognized the weight of the silence surrounding him. The monarchy had faced many storms before: wars, divorces, abdications. But this was different. This was emotional erosion, not political. Personal failings exposed under the unrelenting gaze of modern scrutiny. And while titles, jewels, and palaces could shield against many things, they offered no defense against a woman's truth told plainly to the world. By the time the crisis unit adjourned its final meeting for the week, one royal aide was heard muttering to a colleague, "This wasn't just about Harry. This was about all of us, and we were not prepared." For Prince Harry, the morning after Cressida Bonas's revelations aired was not a morning like any other. The sun rose the same, the coastal winds drifted softly over the Montecito hills, but inside the walls of the Sussex estate, a storm raged. It was not the kind that could be photographed or televised. It was quieter, deeper, and more destabilizing than any public scandal he had faced to date. He was once again the epicenter of an emotional earthquake, one that threatened to upend not just his image, but the very foundations of his current life. Harry had always wrestled with the demons of his past, but something about this particular revelation from Cressida cut differently. When a close friend forwarded him a link to the interview the night before it went viral, he watched it alone, reportedly in his study, with the door locked and the curtains drawn. There was no dramatic reaction, no shattered glass or rage. Just silence. Long, heavy silence that hung in the room like fog. He watched it twice, back to back, and then sat still for almost an hour. Meghan didn't hear about it until later that evening. By then, the media had caught on. Twitter was trending with hashtag Cressida Speaks, and royal watchers were dissecting every word of the interview. She walked into Harry's office, phone in hand, brows furrowed, asking why he hadn't warned her. Harry didn't have an answer. Or perhaps he did, but didn't know how to voice it. Meghan's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and frustration. She had endured so much media hostility since marrying into the royal family, and here, yet again, was another woman painting Harry in a light that felt uncomfortably familiar. Their conversation that night was long and emotionally charged. According to sources close to the Sussexes, it was one of the most difficult discussions they'd had since stepping back from royal duties. Not because Meghan didn't believe him, she did, but because she couldn't ignore the emotional implications. If even part of what Cressida said was true, it pointed to a version of Harry that Meghan didn't fully recognize. A man capable of emotional withdrawal, silent punishments, and relational sabotage when cornered. Harry, for his part, didn't deny the pain he had caused Cressida. He admitted to Meghan that he had been, in his words, lost, angry, and broken during that phase of his life. What stunned him was not that Cressida had spoken. It was how raw and articulate her reflections were. She hadn't painted him as a villain, but as someone incapable of healing from his trauma before dragging others into it. That truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Privately, Harry was torn. He had longed for years to be seen as more than the tragic boy who walked behind his mother's coffin. His charity work, his openness about mental health, his advocacy for veterans. These were all sincere efforts to shape a better version of himself. But here was a woman he once loved, saying that the emotional damage ran so deep that even love wasn't enough to fix it. Worse still, he knew that Cressida wasn't exaggerating. She had been kind in her assessment, even when detailing his cruelty. Her choice not to name him explicitly, but describe the patterns, was strategic and surgical. She wanted to be heard, not to hurt. That made her words even more powerful, and even harder for him to refute. He couldn't call it slander. He couldn't dismiss it as tabloid fiction. This wasn't media manipulation. It was a lived experience. Her truth. In the days that followed, Harry withdrew. Meghan continued with her engagements, but Harry declined several scheduled appearances. He reportedly skipped a planned podcast taping and canceled a private meeting with Netflix executives. While he avoided public outings, his absence only fueled speculation. The media, as expected, ran wild. Theories abounded. Was he spiraling? Was his marriage under pressure? Was this the beginning of a personal reckoning? Inside their Montecito home, Harry vacillated between introspection and agitation. He spent hours rereading old journal entries from the time he dated Cressida. He revisited emails and text exchanges, reliving the arguments and reconciliations that had once defined their love story. One passage from an entry dated months before their breakup reportedly struck him the hardest. In it, he had written, "I feel like I'm poisoning something good." She loves me, and I don't know how to hold that without breaking it. That sentence stayed with him, haunting his thoughts as the press coverage intensified. Meghan, meanwhile, found herself navigating a storm of her own. As much as she wanted to support her husband, she couldn't ignore the emotional weight the interview placed on their relationship. Here was a former girlfriend revealing cracks in Harry's character that Meghan had long attributed to institutional trauma. But what if those cracks weren't just products of the system? What if some of them were deeply embedded in who Harry was, long before she met him? Friends close to the couple revealed that Meghan was empathetic but firm. She encouraged Harry to consider therapy again, something more intensive, perhaps a retreat or a private program designed for emotional reconstruction. Harry initially resisted. He didn't want to be seen as someone perpetually in crisis. He wanted to move forward, not rewind. But Meghan reminded him that forward movement required honest reflection, not suppression. It wasn't just Meghan pushing him. Tyler Perry, one of Harry and Meghan's closest allies since their departure from royal life, also reached out. Known for his emotional intelligence and spiritual grounding, Perry offered guidance in a private phone call. "You can't outrun your past," he reportedly told Harry. "But you can face it, and in doing so, free yourself from it." The advice resonated. Within days, Harry had agreed to a temporary media blackout and scheduled a series of intensive sessions with a trauma specialist in Los Angeles. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but a decision to confront the echoes of his former self that continued to reverberate through his current life. What disturbed Harry the most wasn't the media's reaction. It was the silence from his family in London. Not a single word had been offered publicly in support of him. No clarifying statement. No show of unity. Not even a leak defending his character. The palace's strategy of stonewalling, while effective in containing immediate fallout, left Harry feeling abandoned all over again. He reached out to Prince William via text, just a short message asking if he had seen the interview. There was no reply. Days passed. Still nothing. The ghosting deepened the rift between the brothers. For Harry, it was yet another reminder that his past and present were entangled in a royal machinery that had no interest in personal healing. But not all connections were severed. Princess Eugenie, ever the quiet ally, called Harry to check in. Their conversation, though brief, provided a moment of comfort. She didn't offer advice or judgment. She simply listened. And in that listening, Harry found a sliver of relief. He began reflecting more deeply on his patterns. Why did he retreat emotionally when overwhelmed? Why did he push people away when they got too close? These weren't just byproducts of royal upbringing. They were learned behaviors, coping mechanisms forged in the aftermath of trauma. He began to see that the emotional landmines in his relationship with Cressida weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, unspoken narrative, one he had never truly unpacked. As the days stretched into weeks, the headlines began to soften. Other news stories took precedence. But Harry remained changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on public perception or institutional reform. He was focused on internal healing. He issued no statements, gave no interviews, and filed no lawsuits. That silence was intentional, not strategic. He understood that defending himself publicly would only reignite the flames. Instead, he focused on repairing his emotional foundations, within his marriage, within his own psyche, and perhaps, in time, with the family he had left behind. There were moments of tension at home, but also moments of renewal. Meghan, after some initial strain, became his pillar once more. Their shared commitment to emotional honesty created space for deeper intimacy. They began having longer conversations about the past, not just Harry's, but Meghan's as well. It became a period of mutual excavation, painful but necessary. By the end of the month, Harry was reportedly journaling again, this time not for a memoir or a media piece, but for himself. He had no intention of writing a response to Cressida. He understood now that her truth wasn't about him. It was about her healing. And perhaps, in some strange way, it had become the catalyst for his own. He remained, as ever, a man caught between worlds, the prince shaped by tradition and the husband and father striving for freedom. But in this latest reckoning, he had chosen a third path, one not dictated by palace protocol or public image, but by personal accountability. Within the towering walls of Buckingham Palace and the strategic boardrooms of royal advisors, the aftermath of Cressida Bonas's revelations sent an unmistakable tremor through the institution. Though the monarchy had survived more than a century of crises, wars, abdications, divorces, and Diana, the increasingly personal nature of modern royal scandals presented a uniquely 21st century challenge. The monarchy was now not just about duty and legacy, but about perception, emotion, and personal stories aired before a global audience. Cressida's interview was unlike anything the palace had braced for. She did not name Prince Harry explicitly, but everyone within royal circles and beyond understood who she was referring to. The elegance with which she delivered her account only intensified its impact. There were no bitter tones, no thirst for revenge, just raw emotional honesty. For the royal family, this made it infinitely harder to counter or dismiss. Inside Clarence House, where King Charles and Queen Camilla spend much of their time, an emergency communication strategy meeting was convened the very next morning after the interview aired. Sir Clive Alderton, the King's principal private secretary, chaired the meeting alongside senior communications officials and legal advisors. The central question wasn't just how to respond publicly, if at all, but how this affected the monarchy's image long-term, particularly the fragile perception of unity since Harry and Meghan's departure. King Charles, though aging and reportedly battling intermittent health concerns, was sharp enough to recognize the potential dangers of allowing this moment to spiral unchecked. He reportedly expressed concern not just for the family's public standing, but for Harry's mental well-being. Despite their strained relationship, Charles remained a father, one still hopeful, perhaps naively, that reconciliation was possible. However, Queen Camilla took a sterner view. According to sources familiar with the situation, she warned that Harry's personal emotional entanglements were continuing to drag the family into disrepute. She argued that Cressida's claims, though carefully worded, painted a troubling portrait of emotional neglect and turmoil. Camilla believed that this wasn't a moment for silence. It was a moment to remind the public of the monarchy's role as a steadying institution in chaotic times. The divide in perspective created a noticeable tension in the room. Some advisors supported the traditional approach: say nothing, let the media cycle evolve, and allow the next scandal, be it political or celebrity-based, to overshadow the current one. Others urged a more proactive stance, suggesting a quiet reach-out to Cressida's representatives to gauge whether a diplomatic conversation might be possible, thereby preventing any further revelations. At Kensington Palace, where Prince William and Princess Catherine operate their royal machinery, the mood was equally tense. William was reportedly furious, not at Cressida, but at the situation. He viewed the entire episode as yet another distraction from the royal family's essential work. Behind closed doors, he expressed that Harry's past relationships and emotional baggage had become a continual liability. He was also deeply wary of the potential for further revelations from others in Harry's past, given how this one had exploded. Catherine, always the consummate professional, approached the situation with empathy but caution. She had met Cressida several times during the period she dated Harry. They were never particularly close, but there was mutual respect. Catherine reportedly told William that Cressida's tone indicated someone who had tried to protect Harry, not harm him, and that this moment should be seen as an opportunity, painful as it was, for Harry to grow. Nonetheless, Kensington Palace's press team was swift to prepare talking points for any unexpected press inquiries. Their internal memo emphasized that the Duchess of Sussex had no comment, that the royal family continued to focus on their public duties, and that personal matters from the past were not something the monarchy would engage in publicly. But behind the scenes, there were deeper concerns. The fear wasn't only about reputation, it was about precedent. If more former partners or friends began speaking openly about their experiences with the royals, the institution could face a slow bleed of credibility. Cressida had done something subtle but powerful. She had undermined the image of emotional control that the royal family carefully curates. Her words painted a picture not just of Harry, but of an ecosystem that enabled avoidance, detachment, and emotional dysfunction. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Young, who had once been instrumental in the handling of Meghan and Harry's royal exit, was looped into the broader strategy. He advised caution. He reminded everyone that public sympathy often aligns with authenticity, and that attacking Cressida, or even subtly undermining her, could backfire. The best course, he insisted, was dignified silence. Let the media swirl, let public opinion form and fade, and avoid amplifying the narrative through reaction. But not everyone in the royal machinery agreed. Within the so-called men in gray suits, the senior courtiers, and long-serving aides. There was concern that silence was no longer a sustainable strategy in the digital age. They pointed to how swiftly social media narratives can become entrenched and how hashtags could turn into mainstream perceptions overnight. A growing faction within the institution began quietly advocating for a modernization of response strategy, one that allowed for carefully crafted, empathetic messaging without sounding defensive. Meanwhile, the extended royal family found themselves in a familiar state of limbo. Uncertain whether to speak publicly, privately, or remain completely detached. Princess Eugenie, who maintains a close relationship with Harry, reportedly faced pressure to clarify her stance. Aides advised her to remain silent to avoid inflaming tensions, though she privately reached out to Harry, offering support. Princess Beatrice, on the other hand, took a more removed approach, avoiding any engagement whatsoever. The scandal also created an unusual ripple effect with the younger generation of royals, particularly those coming of age in an era where social media defines perception. Lady Louise Windsor, the daughter of Prince Edward and Sophie, reportedly asked her parents about the Cressida interview and what it meant. It was a rare moment that highlighted the changing dynamics of royal life, where younger family members are no longer shielded from public controversy, but participants in a very modern narrative. Inside the palace, media monitoring became relentless. Every article, tweet, and video dissecting Cressida's revelations was cataloged, analyzed, and fed into internal reports. The communications team studied sentiment trends, key phrases, and viral quotes to assess the damage. Interestingly, they found that public response wasn't universally against Harry. Many commenters expressed sympathy for both him and Cressida. There was a growing recognition that trauma within institutions like the monarchy didn't vanish with a wedding or a title. This nuance gave the palace a sliver of relief. If there was a cultural shift underway, it might be best to observe it rather than challenge it. Still, the most unsettling development was the increasing chatter among former royal insiders. Former aides, past security officers, and even anonymous friends began speaking, some in defense of Harry, others offering vague confirmation of Cressida's characterizations. These whispers didn't make it into official headlines, but they circulated on platforms and forums with intense speculation. The palace feared a slow drip of corroboration, each droplet feeding the narrative that the royal family was emotionally dysfunctional by design. Even within parliamentary circles, the issue was discussed. Though largely symbolic, the monarchy still exists within a democratic framework, and its moral authority hinges on public trust. Senior MPs reportedly questioned whether this kind of personal drama undermined the monarchy's image abroad, especially as the Commonwealth continues to reevaluate its relationship with the Crown. Australia, in particular, saw renewed Republican debates, with commentators arguing that a royal institution mired in family conflict lacked the unity necessary for modern leadership. Ultimately, the palace settled into a familiar but uncomfortable posture, strategic inaction. But this time, the silence didn't project strength, it projected ambiguity. Without a counter-narrative, the public was left to interpret the story based on emotion, intuition, and evolving cultural values. King Charles, in one of his rare private reflections with a close confidant, reportedly expressed regret, not for what Cressida had said, but for how the institution had failed to prepare Harry for life beyond the walls of duty. He confessed that Diana had tried to protect her sons emotionally, but the machinery of monarchy had pulled them into its orbit nonetheless. There was sadness in his words, but also resignation. The monarchy, after all, does not pivot easily. In the end, no official statement was released. No press conference was held. But inside those gilded halls and carefully curated corridors, a shift had occurred. The royal family was beginning to realize that the ghosts of the past would not remain buried. Not in this era. Not with voices like Cressida's echoing through the public consciousness. In the sprawling luxury of the Montecito estate he shares with Meghan Markle, Prince Harry found himself staring at a screen that had become both his ally and his adversary. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the California breeze outside the large bay windows. But inside, the tension was nearly suffocating. The interview had aired. Cressida had spoken, and there was no undoing what had been said. For a man who had spent the better part of his adult life trying to control the narrative of his past, the sudden return of a voice from that very past unspooled everything he had tried to compartmentalize. Prince Harry had once said in interviews that he had a mental filing cabinet of pain, a place where he kept his most traumatic memories, locked away until he had the strength to confront them. Cressida's revelations didn't just unlock one drawer. They yanked open the whole cabinet. His reaction was not immediate. Those around him described him as unnaturally quiet, a rare state for someone known for his humor and occasional emotional impulsiveness. Meghan, observing from across the room, recognized the storm behind the silence. She didn't press him that night. Instead, she gave him the space to wrestle with it in his own way, knowing well enough that some battles couldn't be fought together. The next morning, Harry retreated into his study, where a photograph of Diana still rests on the edge of the fireplace. According to sources close to the couple, it was there that Harry broke down, not just because of what was said, but because of what it confirmed. That his journey out of the monarchy, his relentless search for authenticity, was still incomplete. He had left the institution, but the emotional scars it had inflicted remained vivid, not just in his own life, but in the lives of those he had once loved. Cressida's words, gentle as they were, hit Harry in places he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in years. She spoke of emotional distance, of a man wrestling shadows he couldn't name. And Harry, watching it all unfold, realized she was right. He had pushed her away not out of apathy, but out of fear. Fear that if someone got too close, they would see the broken pieces that royal life had tried so hard to varnish over. Cressida had touched those pieces, and he hadn't known how to handle it. He reached out to a therapist he had worked with during his time in London, scheduling a virtual session. According to insiders, it was one of the most emotionally raw conversations he had ever had. Not because of Cressida specifically, but because of the mirror she had held up to his younger self. He confessed that part of him had always feared her speaking out, not because she would tarnish his name, but because she would reveal the emotional truth he had long hidden even from himself. Meghan, meanwhile, became both supporter and observer. Her concern was evident, but she chose not to make this moment about her. She knew how delicate Harry's emotional architecture was, particularly when it came to his past relationships. Though often painted as jealous or controlling in tabloids, Meghan understood that Harry's past was not a threat to their marriage, but a foundational element of who he had become. And yet, this situation tested even her patience. Not because of Cressida's words, but because of the timing and the wound it reopened. In private conversations, Harry and Meghan revisited some of their earliest struggles as a couple. Harry admitted that some of the emotional baggage he had carried into their relationship had roots far deeper than he had previously articulated. Cressida's interview didn't just haunt his memories. It illuminated the patterns that had followed him into his marriage. It forced a conversation that, though painful, might have been long overdue. Harry wrote a letter, not for publication, not for social media, but for himself. In it, he addressed Cressida directly. Sources say it was part apology, part gratitude. He thanked her for loving him when he didn't yet know how to love himself fully. He apologized for the walls he had built, for the distance he had enforced, and for the way their story had ended not with anger, but with silence. It was never meant to be permanent, he wrote, just necessary for survival. But as he folded the letter and tucked it away, perhaps never to be sent, he knew that this reckoning wasn't about mending the past. It was about understanding it. And in that understanding, he began to find clarity. Still, the weight of public speculation bore down. Harry could not escape the headlines, the social media commentary, or the resurfacing of old clips showing him and Cressida during public engagements. The world was dissecting their relationship all over again, using modern tools of scrutiny. For Harry, it was like being thrust backward through time, forced to relive a chapter he had thought closed. He called his old friend Tom Skippy Inskip, one of the few people who had remained in his life despite the turbulence of his royal transition. The two spoke candidly about the Cressida situation. Tom reminded Harry of the nights they would sit up talking about love, duty, and the weight of expectations. He told Harry, with brutal honesty, that he had always sensed Cressida was the one that got too close, and that scared him. The conversation, though painful, grounded Harry. He began to see that his flight from the monarchy had never been just about the press, or protocol, or even Meghan. It had been a desperate pursuit of emotional safety. As the days passed, Meghan encouraged him to seek more therapeutic support, not just to process the Cressida revelations, but to delve deeper into the emotional architecture of his younger self. He agreed, And for the first time since publishing his memoir, he began work on a follow-up, not a book, but a private journal he kept for himself. In it, he reflected not just on Cressida, but on the versions of himself he had left behind. The teenage Harry who raged at the world. The military Harry who found structure but not peace. The royal Harry who smiled in public but crumbled in private. Cressida's words became a catalyst, not of destruction, but of introspection. And though the world expected scandal, what unfolded instead was a slow, quiet re-examination of identity. Harry began spending more time with his children, drawing strength from the simplicity of fatherhood. Archie's laughter became a balm. Lilibet's gaze reminded him that healing wasn't just for the past, it was for the future too. Meghan, seeing this transformation, offered her support without condition. She reminded him that no one is born whole. We become whole through acknowledgement, through courage, and through love. Harry listened, not as a prince, not as a husband, but as a man finally beginning to understand himself. Still, the question of how to respond publicly loomed. Meghan's PR team advised against any formal statement. Doing so would only prolong the media cycle and suggest defensiveness. But Harry wanted to speak, not to defend himself, but to express gratitude, not to Cressida publicly, but to everyone who had shown him compassion, even when he had not always deserved it. Eventually, he released a short, heartfelt podcast episode under the Archewell audio banner. In it, he didn't mention Cressida by name, but he spoke of former relationships as teachers. Sometimes, the people who leave your life leave behind lessons that shape you more than anything else, he said. And sometimes, we